In the flickering neon shadows of a Seoul convenience store, 68-year-old Kim Soonja is reduced to trembling as she reaches for a discarded bag of expired bread. Her neat but frayed hanbok is a testament to a dignity the world has forgotten, even as a callous young clerk mocks her hunger and shoves her aside. She doesn't realize that watching from the tinted glass of a parked luxury sedan is Han Song-jin, the feared Mafia boss of the underworld and the silent owner of the very ground she stands on. Han Song-jin is a man who lives by the code that empathy is a terminal illness and control is the only currency worth holding. Yet, as he watches the old widow offer a quiet, humble apology to the man who insulted her, the icy walls of his composure begin to fracture. In her weathered face, he sees the living ghost of the grandmother he left to die in poverty while he climbed the ranks of the syndicate, a debt of blood he never repaid. Driven by a burning shame he cannot name, he makes a decision that will rattle the foundations of the Seoul underworld. Stepping out into the humid night air in a suit that costs more than the widow's life is worth, he doesn't offer a hand of violence, but a hand of unexpected salvation. He buys the entire store on the spot with a single phone call, handing the keys to a woman who was just begging for crumbs. This moment ignites an impossible bond between a man who has traded his soul for power and a woman who has nothing left but her resilience. Together, they will face a treacherous path where the widow's quiet strength becomes the only weapon capable of melting the Mafia boss. The morning sun struggled to pierce the gray smog of the slums, but for Kim Soonja, the chill was a familiar companion. She sat on a low wooden stool outside her shack, her frail hands busily mending a tear in her only decent hanbok. The memory of the previous night, the man with the icy eyes and the sudden, overwhelming gift of a store, felt like a fever dream. She expected to wake up to the same hollow ache of hunger, yet the world felt different, heavier with a silence she couldn't name. That silence was shattered by the rhythmic thrum of heavy engines. 3 charcoal black SUVs navigated the narrow, unpaved lane, their polished frames looking like alien obsidian against the rusted corrugated metal of the neighborhood. Neighbors peered through cracked windows as the vehicles came to a synchronized halt in front of Soonja's dwelling. 6 men stepped out. They were impeccably dressed in black suits, their faces masked by a professional, terrifying neutrality. One man, clearly the leader, stepped forward carrying a lacquered box tied with a golden silk ribbon. The neighbors whispered in hushed, frightened tones, assuming that Mafia boss men had come to collect a debt or deliver a sentence. The man stopped before Soonja and bowed deeply, a gesture of respect so profound it seemed to confuse the very air between them. Chairman Han Song-jin sends his regards, Mother Kim, the man said, his voice low and steady. He held out the box with both hands. He noticed you had a preference for traditional flavors. This was prepared this morning by the head chef at the Shilla. Soonja's breath hitched. As she took the box, the warmth radiating through the wood seeped into her calloused palms. She didn't open it immediately, she simply looked at the gold ribbon, a symbol of a world she had never been allowed to touch. I am a poor woman, she whispered, her voice trembling but her spine straight. I have no way to pay for such a thing. The debt has already been settled, the man replied. He didn't explain further. With another bow, the men retreated to their vehicles. As the SUVs pulled away, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the scent of expensive cologne, Soonja slowly untied the ribbon. Inside, nestled on beds of aromatic rice, were delicacies she hadn't tasted in 40 years, braised short ribs, delicate abalone, and vibrant seasonal greens, all arranged with the precision of a painting. She picked up the silver chopsticks included in the set, but her hand stopped mid-air. She looked toward the tinted windows of the convenience store at the end of the block, sensing that Mafia boss was watching. For the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like a beggar. She felt like a guest. And in his high-rise office miles away, Han Song-jin stared at a security feed of the old woman, feeling a strange, uncomfortable thaw beginning to stir in his chest. The golden lacquer box sat untouched on the low wooden table inside Soonja's shack, its presence an invasive brilliance against the stained wallpaper and shadows. The aroma of braised short ribs and toasted sesame oil filled the small room, a scent so rich it felt like a mockery of the decades she had spent flavoring watery porridge with nothing but salt and resilience. Sunja stared at the silk ribbon for a long time, her stomach cramping in protest, but her mind was fixed on the image of the men in black suits, men whose hands were too steady, whose eyes were too empty. She knew what those suits meant. She had lived long enough to know that in this city, a feast delivered in darkness was rarely a gift, it was a down payment on a soul. An hour later, the black Mercedes returned, gliding to the curb like a silent predator. Han Song-jin remained inside, watching the small, crooked door of the shack, expecting to see the widow emerge with a face softened by gratitude. Instead, the door creaked open, and Sunja stepped out. She was not carrying the food in her belly, she was carrying the box in her arms, held as far from her body as her frail strength allowed. She approached the car and tapped on the tinted glass. The window slid down with a mechanical hum, revealing the Mafia boss, in his natural habitat of leather and silence. "Take it back," she said, her voice thin but as sharp as a reed. She placed the box on the edge of the window frame. Song-jin's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Is the quality not to your liking?" "It is from the best kitchen in the district." "The quality is fine," Sunja replied, meeting his cold gaze with a stare that did not waver. "But I have spent 68 years keeping my heart clean. I have begged for crumbs and slept in the cold, but I have never tasted food bought with blood. I will not start now, even if it means I never eat again." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of a siren. Song-jin felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine insult, followed immediately by a reluctant, stinging respect. No one talked to him this way. No one refused him. He looked at the box, the golden box that symbolized his power, and saw it through her eyes as a container of filth. "You think you are better than me because you are hungry?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "No," Sunja whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of her cheek. "I think I am human because I can still feel the difference between a gift and a bribe. If you want to help me, Han Song-jin, do not send your soldiers. Come as a man, or do not come at all." She turned and walked back to her shack, leaving the most powerful man in Seoul staring at a pile of cold, expensive meat, wondering when he had forgotten how to be a man. The following morning, the Mafia boss did not send a car, he sent a demolition crew. Sunja was jolted awake by the mechanical roar of an excavator idling at the edge of her makeshift garden. When she stepped outside, she found Han Song-jin standing amidst the rubble of the neighboring shacks, his tailored charcoal suit a sharp, jarring contrast to the dust and decay of the slums. He wasn't looking at the machines, he was looking at her, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "This block has been condemned," Song-jin said, his voice cutting through the noise of the engines. "The city has deemed these structures a fire hazard. By noon, there will be nothing left but dirt." Sunja clutched the collar of her hanbok, her eyes widening with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Where am I supposed to go? This is all I have. I am a businessman, Sunja." "I do not believe in waste," he replied, stepping closer until his shadow completely eclipsed her frail frame. "I have a property on the outskirts of the city that requires oversight. It is far too large for my staff to manage alone, and I find their lack of attention to detail irritating. You will move there immediately. You will keep the rooms aired and the gardens tended. It is a matter of professional convenience. I told you I would not take your blood money," she reminded him, her voice trembling. "This is not a gift," he countered coldly. "It is an eviction. You can go to a government shelter where they will lose your name in a filing cabinet, or you can do me the favor of occupying a house that would otherwise sit empty. My men are already packing your things." Before she could protest, 2 guards emerged from her shack carrying her meager belongings, a few faded photographs, her mending kit, and a small ceramic jar. They moved with a clinical efficiency that left no room for argument. Song-jin opened the door to his sedan, gesturing for her to enter. The drive took them away from the gray concrete of Seoul and into the lush, rolling hills of the countryside. They pulled up to a sprawling estate, a masterpiece of dark wood and white stone surrounded by high walls and armed security. It was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. As the gates hissed shut behind them, Sunja realized she had been trapped in a cage of gold. Song-jin led her to a sun-drenched room overlooking a koi pond, the floors polished to a mirror shine. "Stay here," he commanded, though his eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he noticed her touching the silk curtains. "I cannot have the owner of my convenience stores living in a hovel. It's bad for the brand's image." He turned to leave, but Sunja's quiet voice stopped him at the door. "You are a very poor liar, Han Song-jin." He didn't look back, but the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He wasn't just giving her a home, he was building a wall between the world's cruelty and the only person who had looked at him with pity instead of fear. For the Mafia boss, it wasn't about charity anymore, it was about territorial protection. And Sunja was now his most sacred territory. Life inside the fortress was governed by a silence that Sunja found unbearable. The men patrolling the halls were shadows in suits, their faces masks of stone, their hands never straying far from the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. Han Song-jin, the Mafia boss, watched her from the security monitors, expecting her to hide in her room, intimidated by the violent world he had brought her into. Instead, he found her in the kitchen. Sunja had ignored the gourmet catering Song-jin provided. Instead, she had convinced one of the younger guards to take her to a local market for simple ingredients, fermented soybean paste, fresh garlic, and bundles of wild greens. As Song-jin entered the dining hall that evening, the smell of doenjang jjigae hit him like a physical blow to the chest, a scent that belonged to a childhood he had tried to bury under layers of expensive cologne and blood. He found his most lethal enforcers sitting awkwardly at the long mahogany table. They weren't holding their breath in fear, they were holding spoons. Sunja moved between them like a gentle spirit, scolding a high-ranking lieutenant for his poor posture and fussing over the thin coat of a lookout who had just come in from the rain. "Sit down, Song-jin," she commanded without looking up from the stove. "You look like you haven't had a real meal since you started wearing those ridiculous suits." The guards froze, waiting for the Mafia boss to erupt. Song-jin stared at her, his authority challenged in his own home by a woman who barely reached his shoulder. Yet, as she placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of him and adjusted his collar with a mother's practice touch, the Mafia boss failed to appear. He sat. He ate. And for the first time in 20 years, the cold knot in his stomach began to loosen. The widow wasn't just living in his house, she was systematically dismantling the walls of his empire, one bowl of soup at a time. The dining hall was silent, save for the soft clink of silver against porcelain. The high-ranking guards had retreated to the perimeter of the estate, leaving the Mafia boss and the widow alone under the soft glow of the chandelier. Song-jin watched the steam curl from his bowl, the scent of the soup acting as a key to a vault he had kept locked for nearly 2 decades. He didn't look at Sunja, he couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the simple, weathered grain of the wooden spoon she had insisted he use. "My grandmother used to make this," Song-jin said, his voice so low it was almost swallowed by the vastness of the room. "But she didn't have fresh greens or garlic. She had whatever she could find in the dirt behind the tenements." Sunja stopped eating, her eyes softening as she watched the man the world called a monster. She didn't press him. She simply waited, her presence a quiet sanctuary. "I was 20 when I was sent to prison the first time," he continued, his grip tightening on the spoon until his knuckles turned white. "I thought I was being a provider. I thought the money I was making on the streets would save her. But when the gates closed behind me, there was no one left to look after her. I had the money hidden, but she was too proud to touch it, or perhaps too ashamed of how I'd earned it." He finally looked up, and for the first time, the cold authority was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding honesty. She died while I was in a cell. She died of malnutrition and pneumonia in a room that didn't have heat. The guards told me like they were reading a weather report. By the time I got out, I had enough power to buy the whole city, but I couldn't buy back a single breath for her. He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the city where he ruled. When I saw you at that store, begging for crumbs while I sat in a car that cost more than your life. I felt the ghost of her looking at me. I realized I hadn't built an empire. I just built a bigger cage to hide my shame. Sunja reached across the table, her small, calloused hand covering his. Her touch was light, but to Song Jin, it felt like the weight of a mountain. Regret is a poison that only the living drink, Song Jin, she whispered. You cannot save her. But you are sitting here now, eating soup made by an old woman who would have died in the cold if you hadn't stepped out of that car. That is not shame. That is a beginning. The Mafia boss didn't pull away. He sat in the silence, the warmth of the meal and the woman's hand slowly seeping into his bones, melting the ice that had protected his heart for far too long. He was still a king of a dark world, but in that moment, he was also a grandson, finally coming home. The sanctuary of the estate, once defined by the scent of simmering stew and quiet conversation, began to feel the chill of the world outside. While Sunja spent her afternoons tending to the neglected herb garden, oblivious to the digital whispers traveling through the city's underbelly, the atmosphere in the syndicate's headquarters grew thick with unease. In the smoke-filled backrooms of Seoul's high-stakes gambling dens and the steel-and-glass towers of rival territories, the narrative of the untouchable Mafia boss was being rewritten. The rumors moved like a virus. It started with a whisper from a disgruntled guard who had been scolded by an old woman for his dirty boots, and it ended in the ears of men who dealt in the currency of leverage. They spoke of the glacier losing his edge, how the man who once ordered executions with a flick of his wrist was now being seen carrying groceries for a frail widow in a frayed hanbok. To his enemies, this wasn't an act of redemption, it was a structural flaw in a fortress they had long considered impenetrable. At a secluded wharf in Incheon, the leaders of the rival syndicate gathered under the flickering amber lights of a warehouse. They reviewed grainy surveillance photos of the estate's perimeter, focusing not on the armed guards, but on the small, silver-haired woman hanging laundry in the sun. A mother figure, one of them mused, his voice dripping with a predatory hunger. Song Jin has finally given us a target that isn't made of stone. He has grown a heart, and that is where we will drive the blade. Back at the estate, Song Jin stood on the balcony, his eyes scanning the tree line where the shadows seemed a little too deep, a little too still. He felt the shift in the air, the way the vultures were beginning to circle, sensing a scent they hadn't smelled on him in 20 years, vulnerability. He looked down at the courtyard where Sunja was carefully potting a new sprout, her movements slow and peaceful. The weight of his past was colliding with the hope of his present, and the Mafia boss knew that the peace he had found was an invitation for war. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, his expression returning to a mask of ice, but his heart hammered with a new kind of fear. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore, he was afraid of what would happen to the woman who had taught him how to live. The morning mist clung to the mountains of the Gangwon province as the black sedan climbed the winding road toward the village of Gyeramri. Inside the car, Sunja sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wide as she recognized the jagged silhouette of the peaks she hadn't seen in over 40 years. Beside her, Han Song-jin, the Mafia boss, remained silent, his gaze fixed on a folder of legal documents. He had replaced his usual sharp black tie with a simpler open collar, a subtle concession to the rural air. As the car rounded a final bend, the village came into view. It was a skeleton of a place, collapsed thatch roofs, overgrown patties, and stone walls crumbling into the earth. The youth had long since fled to the neon lights of Seoul, leaving the hamlet to rot in the sun. Sunja pressed a hand to the window, a soft gasp escaping her lips. It was the place of her birth, the place where she had buried her husband and her parents, now a ghost of its former self. They were going to clear it all for a limestone quarry, Song Jin said, his voice breaking the stillness. The contracts were signed last month. The demolition was scheduled for next Tuesday. Sunja turned to him, her voice a mere whisper. And now? Song Jin handed her a gold-embossed deed. The quarry project is dead. I bought the land, the village, and the surrounding hills. Not under the syndicate's name, but under a new foundation. We've hired architects specializing in traditional restoration. By next spring, the paddies will be flooded again, and the schoolhouse will be a community center. Sunja looked at the papers, then back at the ruins. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't trying to buy her loyalty or erase his shame with expensive gifts. He was using his power to preserve a memory that the rest of the world considered worthless. This is a great deal of money, Song Jin, she murmured. There is no profit in an old village. For the first time in my life, I am not looking for profit, the Mafia boss replied, looking out at the valley. This was his first move into the light, a legitimate venture that his underbosses back in Seoul were already calling a madness. He could feel the eyes of his rivals on his back, mocking his sentimentality, but as he watched a single tear of joy track through the deep wrinkles of Sunja's smile, he realized this was the only territory worth holding. He wasn't just restoring a village, he was building a bridge back to the man he might have been. The Mafia boss was gone for a moment, replaced by a son returning home to build a garden for a mother who had never forgotten how to hope. The air inside the syndicate's boardroom was colder than the winter wind whipping against the skyscraper's glass. Han Song-jin sat at the head of the table, his eyes tracing the maps of the Jiram re-restoration project, unaware that the shadow across the room had already sharpened its blade. Underboss Park, a man who had served Song-jin for a decade, stood by the window, his reflection hiding a sneer of utter contempt. To Park, the village project wasn't a noble venture, it was a surrender. He saw a king who had traded his iron crown for a watering can, and in the underworld, a king who softened was a king who deserved to be toppled. Later that night, Park met with a representative of the rival Kim clan in a dimly lit underground parking garage. He didn't ask for money or territory, he asked for a coup. From his breast pocket, he pulled a handwritten set of coordinates and a schedule of the perimeter shifts at the country estate. He's moved his heart outside the city walls, Park whispered, his voice echoing off the concrete. The old woman is the only thing that makes him human now. Take her, and you'll see the glacier shatter into 1,000 pieces of glass. When he falls, I lead what's left. The leak was a calculated betrayal, a surgical strike meant to prove that mercy was a luxury no Mafia boss could afford. Park watched the Kim clan's black van speed away toward the mountains, feeling no remorse, only a clinical satisfaction. He believed he was saving the syndicate by removing the weakness that Sunja represented. He failed to realize that by targeting the widow, he wasn't attacking Song-jin's weakness, he was unleashing the very monster he thought he was taming. Back at the estate, the night was unnervingly still. Sunja was in the kitchen, humming a low folk song as she prepared a jar of pickled radishes for the winter. Outside, the first of the rival hitters moved through the tree line, guided by Park's treacherous map. The silence was finally broken by the sharp, rhythmic snap of a dry branch under a heavy boot. On his way back from the city, Song-jin's phone buzzed with a security alert. He looked at the screen, his blood turning to liquid nitrogen. The betrayal was clear, the threat was imminent, and as he floored the accelerator, the Mafia boss realized that the world was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to take everything from a man who has finally found something to lose. The stillness of the mountain night shattered with the glass-breaking roar of a flashbang. High-intensity light flooded the estate's courtyard, followed immediately by the rhythmic thud of tactical boots hitting the stone pavement. Inside the kitchen, Sunja dropped her jar of radishes, the glass splintering across the floor like diamonds. Before she could scream, the kitchen door burst open, and Han Song-jin lunged inside. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, and his eyes held a terrifying, focused clarity. "Don't look at them, mother. Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that cut through the chaos. Outside, the air filled with the sharp, metallic chatter of automatic gunfire. The Kim clan's hitters were moving with the precision Park had sold them, bypassing the outer sensors and swarming the main house. Song-jin grabbed Soonja, shielding her small frame with his own as a spray of bullets raked the kitchen cabinets, sending shards of wood and porcelain flying. He didn't flinch as a fragment of glass sliced his cheek, his only concern was the woman trembling beneath his arms. He moved her toward the hallway, using the heavy mahogany furniture as cover. Every time a shadow appeared in a window or a muzzle flash lit up the corridor, Song-jin positioned himself between the threat and the widow. He was a human shield, a wall of flesh and expensive fabric absorbing the danger that was meant for her. When a stray round shattered a decorative vase just inches from Soonja's head, Song-jin threw his entire weight over her, pinning her safely against the floor as he returned fire with a grim, surgical efficiency. "We're almost there," he hissed, his breath ragged. He hauled her toward the study, where a heavy bookshelf concealed the entrance to the reinforced safe room. A hitter burst through the terrace doors, leveling a weapon at Soonja's back. Without hesitation, Song-jin pivoted, taking the impact of a bullet in his shoulder to ensure his return shot found its mark. He didn't let out a sound. He simply shoved the bookshelf aside and thrust Soonja into the cold, steel-lined sanctuary. "Lock it from the inside," he gasped, blood beginning to bloom across the white cotton of his shirt like a dark flower. Soonja reached out, her fingers catching his crimson-stained cuff. "Song-jin, come inside. You're hurt." He offered her a ghost of a smile, the first one that reached his eyes. "I can't. If I go in, they'll just spend all night trying to get through the door. If I stay out here, I can end this." He gently uncurled her fingers. "I told you I would protect your dignity, mother. I won't let them touch a hair on your head." He slammed the door shut, the heavy bolts sliding into place with a final, echoing thud. Standing alone in the darkened study, the Mafia boss leaned against the steel door, his blood dripping onto the floor he had bought to keep her safe. He checked his magazine, his face hardening back into the glacier mask, but with a new, lethal purpose. He wasn't fighting for territory or pride anymore, he was fighting for the only home he had ever truly known. The silence following the heavy thud of the safe room door was short-lived. Outside, the estate had become a tomb of smoke and spent shell casings. Song-jin leaned his back against the cold steel, his breath coming in jagged hitches as blood soaked through the shoulder of his white shirt. He gripped his weapon, eyes scanning the shadows of the study, but the expected final rush of gunmen never came. Instead, the heavy silence was punctuated by the shrill, persistent ringing of his cell phone. He answered it with a trembling hand. "Park," he spat, the name tasting like ash. "You always were too sentimental, Song-jin," the underboss's voice crackled through the line, devoid of remorse. "Did you really think a steel door would stop a man who knows all your secrets? Check the ventilation feed, boss." Song-jin's heart plummeted. He lunged for the security console on his desk. The infrared camera inside the safe room showed a horrific sight, a hidden secondary hatch, one he had forgotten in his haste, had been forced. The room was empty. A single, frayed silk ribbon from Soonja's hanbok lay on the floor like a drop of blood. "We have her," Park continued, his tone turning clinical. "The Kim clan doesn't want your life, Song-jin. They want the Jiram-ri deeds, the port codes, and your formal resignation. You have 1 hour to meet us at the old shipyard. If you show up with your men, she dies. If you don't show up with the transfer papers, she dies slowly." The ultimatum was a jagged blade pressed against his throat. For 20 years, Song-jin had lived for the syndicate. He had bled for the territory, killed for the rank, and sacrificed his soul to become the Mafia boss the world feared. To sign those papers was to erase his existence, to become a man with no shadow and no protection. Without the empire, he was a dead man walking. He looked at the empty chair where Soonja had sat just days ago, scolding him for his pride while she mended his socks. He realized then that the empire wasn't a throne, it was the weight that had kept him from ever truly standing up. "Keep her safe," Song Jin whispered into the phone, his voice no longer that of a boss, but of a man who had finally found his North Star. "I'm coming. And I'm bringing everything you asked for." He didn't call his lieutenants. He didn't arm himself for a massacre. Instead, he opened the floor safe, withdrew the mountain of deeds and digital keys that represented his life's work, and walked toward his car. The glacier had finally melted, leaving behind a man who understood that an empire was a small price to pay for the hand of the only person who had ever truly loved him. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted hulls and skeletal cranes, the air thick with the scent of salt and rot. Under the flickering amber glow of a single street lamp, Han Song-jin stood alone, his silhouette sharp against the fog. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the physical pain was a distant hum compared to the hollow silence of the industrial wasteland. Underboss Park stepped out from the shadows of a corrugated warehouse, flanked by the leadership of the Kim clan. Behind them, bound to a wooden chair, sat Sunja. Her hanbok was torn, and her face was bruised, but her eyes, those resilient, unyielding eyes, remained fixed on Song Jin with a look of profound sorrow, not for herself, but for what she knew he was about to do. "The papers, Song Jin," Park demanded, his voice echoing with a greedy edge. "The digital keys to the offshore accounts, the signed deeds to the ports, and the resignation from the council." Without a word, Song Jin reached into his inner pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger, the secret history of every bribe, every blood-soaked contract, and every name that held his empire together. In his other hand, he held a simple chrome lighter. "You think this power is a throne, Park," Song Jin said, his voice as calm as a frozen sea. "You think it makes you a god. But I have spent my life guarding a graveyard." With a flick of his thumb, the flame hissed to life. He touched it to the corner of the ledger. The paper caught instantly, the ink of his legacy curling into black ash. One by one, he dropped the encrypted hard drives and the signed transfer deeds into a metal drum at his feet, dousing them with gasoline and tossing the lighter inside. The Kim clan leaders surged forward, desperate to save the documents, but the fire was too fast. Song Jin watched the flames roar, the heat melting the glacier once and for all. He saw 20 years of violence and fear turning into smoke, rising into the indifferent night sky. He felt lighter with every second that passed, the heavy iron mantle of the Mafia boss dissolving into nothingness. "It's gone," Song Jin whispered, looking past the stunned traders to the old woman. "All of it. There is no Han Syndicate anymore. There is just me." Park realized too late that he had inherited a ghost. The power he had craved was tied to the man, not the papers, and the man had just walked away from it. In the confusion of the ruined deal, Song Jin stepped forward. He didn't look back at the burning barrel or the men who had betrayed him. He walked straight to Sunja, his hand steady as he untied her ropes. He didn't care about the territory he had lost or the fortune he had burned. As he helped her stand, her frail weight leaning against his blood-stained shirt, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was truly powerful. He had traded a kingdom for a soul, and in the silence of the shipyard, he finally found the only thing more valuable than fear, peace. The seasons had turned many times since the fire at the shipyard, and with them, the legend of the glacier had vanished into the quiet soil of the countryside. In a small, sun-drenched corner of the Gangwon province, the only thing Han Song-jin commanded was the growth of the hydrangeas and the direction of the morning glory vines. He wore no tailored silk or Italian leather, instead, his hands were stained with the dark, honest earth of a community garden he had built for the village of Jairamri. He moved with a steady, unhurried pace, kneeling in the dirt to prune a stray branch. The sharp, clinical precision he once used to dismantle rival syndicates was now reserved for the delicate veins of a leaf. There was a profound silence in his life now, but it wasn't the heavy, predatory silence of a man looking over his shoulder. It was the peace of a man who no longer had anything to hide. Near the edge of the garden, sitting on a sturdy wooden bench Song-jin had carved himself, was Kim Soon-ja. She looked frail, her hair now the color of winter frost, but her eyes were brighter than they had been in the years she spent begging for crumbs. She wore a new hanbok, simple and elegant, and a soft wool shawl to ward off the mountain breeze. She watched him work, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, the smile of a woman who had witnessed a miracle. A group of local children ran past the garden gate, laughing as they headed toward the newly restored community center. One of them waved at Song-jin, calling him teacher, a title he accepted with a humble nod. He looked up from the soil, his face weathered by the sun rather than hardened by hate. He glanced toward the bench, catching Soon-ja's gaze. In that look, 1,000 words of gratitude passed between them. He had given her a home and a village, but she had given him back his soul. He reached into the dirt and pulled a small, stubborn weed from the base of a rosebush, tossing it aside. It was a simple act, but to Song-jin, it felt like the ultimate victory. The Mafia boss was dead, buried under layers of growth and seasons of care. As the afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley, Soon-ja leaned back and closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic sound of her son's shears. She had lived to see the impossible, a heart of ice transformed into a garden of peace.